In this lesson, we're going to discuss cost curves for particular firms. As we'll see, these cost curves are a way to characterize how firms operate and is very useful for examining what happens whether they're in competitive markets or in monopolistic markets, whatever. Cost curves really describe how the firm acts, and you'll see it'll be a very valuable way to think about the economic behavior of firms. When we think about cost curves and costs for a firm, it's very important to distinguish between what economists call the short run and the long run. In the short run, only some inputs to production can be adjusted, such as labor. It's not enough time to adjust all the inputs, such as capital. So only one or some of the inputs can be adjusted in the short run. In contrast, in the long run, there's enough time to adjust all the inputs, to get more capital, to get more factories, to get more machines, not only to hire more workers, which is really what the short run is all about. Today we're going to focus on the short run and later on consider the long run. When you think about costs, you've got to distinguish between what's called a fixed costs and variable costs. Fixed costs is the amount that you have to pay for the trucks or the buildings or the terminals for a business firm. They're fixed during the period of consideration, fixed during this short run, as I put it. But in the short run, some things can be varied, and particularly the amount of workers can be varied. And that variance or changes in the amount of workers create something called variable costs. So again, fixed costs are the things that are not able to change much in the short run, not change at all in the short run. But in the short run, you can change your variable costs. This little picture illustrates this in the case of a company that's moving pianos. The business is here just moving things. And as you can see, you need some workers to move the objects, move the pianos, say, or the piano benches, whatever it is you're moving. And you can consider having more workers and therefore produce more. So on the left, you see an amount of workers that's required to get 5 moves in a day. And on the right, you see the number of workers required to get twice as many, 10 moves in a day. In both cases, the fixed costs, which is this, the moving trucks or moving vans and the terminals or the facilities where the trucks are parked or are serviced, they're fixed in both cases. So here we consider just the short run, again, where the capital, which is the trucks in this case, or the buildings, capital is fixed. You can see 4 trucks and 2 terminals in both cases, but the number of workers changes. And so what we're going to look at is what happens to costs when the number of workers change. And now I want to give an example. At the top of these blocks and the top of this sketch, you can see total costs are represented in 2 different cases. And total costs, as you know, depend on the sum of this fixed cost and variable cost. So now we want to look more carefully about what's going on at this firm, at this example firm, by looking at some particular data. What we want to do with this data is compute some things. And this is kind of a preview of what we want to compute, where we're going. First, we want to compute the average total cost. That's the total cost of producing in a particular period, a particular amount, divided by the total quantity produced. Symbolically, TC for total cost divided by the quantity. Sometimes economists call this cost per unit, just another way to describe average total cost. We also want to look at average variable cost. That's the variable cost, the cost of the workers in this particular case, divided by the quantity. And finally, we want to look at average fixed cost. That's the cost for the capital, that is the trucks and the terminals and the buildings. That's also going to be divided by the quantity produced, in which case we get average fixed costs. So again, in each case there's an average. There's average total cost, which is total cost divided by the quantity. There's average variable cost, which is variable cost divided by the quantity. And of course, average fixed cost, which is fixed cost divided by the quantity produced. Now let's look at some examples of how we compute these. This is costs at a typical firm. A typical firm could be moving pianos or whatever it happens to be. And as you see, look at this table carefully to start off. On the far left, we have the number of things that are produced. In this case, it's the number of pianos that are moved in a day. And I have that going down the column as more and more things are produced. In this case, more and more pianos are moved. And then in the next few columns, you can see the total costs, the fixed costs, and the variable costs. And as you can see, total costs rise as more is produced. Fixed costs do not rise. That's the amount that has to be paid for the capital. That's not changing because remember, this is a short run. Fixed costs are fixed in the short run. But then the third column of the numbers is the variable costs, and those do increase as more workers are hired. Now, to get these average things that we just defined, all we need to do is divide each of those columns by the quantity produced. So the column labeled average total cost just divides total cost by the quantity. And you can see as total costs are increasing, you here on the far left-hand side of this table, the average total cost, at least for part of this thing, part of this expansion actually declines for a while because you're able to divide that total cost by larger numbers. Then you have the average fixed cost, and that certainly declines because you're taking a fixed number, like $300, and dividing it by more and more things. So if you divide 300 by 2, that's the average fixed cost when you're producing 2. In this case, it's 150. And then finally, the average variable cost, and you can see the behavior of the average variable cost as you come down the column. We've already talked about marginal costs, and remember, that's the change in total costs as you produce more. So now we're going to consider not only that marginal cost, which we've already considered, as I say, but also these average total costs. To get a sense of what's going on in this table, it's useful to plot the numbers. So I want to look at these average numbers in a picture. I'm just going to plot those so it's easier to see what's going on. To get a better understanding of the data that are in that table in this example about average total cost and average variable cost and marginal cost, I want to plot these in a diagram. And when I do, I'm going to get something called the marginal cost curve, the average total cost curve, and the average variable cost. So let's just start doing that. We just plot the numbers here. And so first notice on the quantity, the horizontal axis, the quantity produced is plotted. On the vertical axis, we have dollars. Now we can just plot the points in that table. And this is kind of straightforward. You just plot the points and connect them. So those were the marginal cost points that are in the table. And now we're plotting a second curve. And as you can see, this is average total costs. And below that, we're just plotting the average variable costs, the total amount of variable cost divided by the quantity. So each of these averages, remember, we're dividing by the quantity, and the marginal cost, which we've considered in the past, is the change in total costs. Now look at these curves carefully. First of all, you can see marginal cost through a large part of the range of production, 3, 4, 5 quantity, it increases. The marginal cost increases over time. We've also added a little bit of extra interesting things here because at very low levels of production, you see marginal costs are actually declining a little bit. And the reason why marginal costs can decline when you're producing very small amounts there is that you can actually get more than double the amount when you double the amount of workers, or you can increase the workers by a percentage and get even given more output. So think about the piano moving again. If you were trying to move one piano around, you might have one worker, and that would be great. It'd be kind of hard for one worker to move a piano. But if you had 2 workers, you could probably move 2 pianos much easier. You could probably even do more than 2 pianos with the same amount of work or even less work. And so in this case, the marginal cost of producing 2 pianos is less than the marginal cost of producing 1 piano. And it continues to decline through 3 pianos. But eventually, you have the marginal cost coming in, there's diminishing returns to labor, and again, you see the marginal cost starting to increase as normal. So other than that little dip at the beginning, this is just the kind of marginal cost curve we considered in the past. But now look at these average cost curves, average total cost or average variable cost. As you can see, first looking at average total cost, that comes down and then starts to increase. It comes down because you're able to reduce your average total cost because you're producing more. Basically, your fixed costs here are being spread around, and you're able to produce more because of that fixed cost being spread over a larger amount. So the total cost actually declines on an average basis, and you can see that quite dramatically in the picture. Average variable cost also declines, as you can see in the picture, and it's of course below the average total costs. And the difference between the two green lines, the difference between the average total cost and the average variable cost, is of course the average fixed cost, because that's the difference between total cost and variable cost is fixed cost. So you can see that's declining throughout. That difference between the two green lines gets smaller because your fixed cost is being divided by larger and larger quantities, and therefore the average fixed cost, which is what it is, declines. Now, when you look at a diagram like this, there's important things to notice. First, the marginal cost curve cuts through the average total cost curve. And it's very interesting. It cuts through the average total cost curve at almost the bottom point, in fact, literally the bottom point of the average total cost curve. And so what that means is that when average total cost is declining, marginal cost is below average total cost. And when average total cost is increasing, marginal cost is above average total cost. This is a common feature of averages. If you could think about people in a room of different heights, if someone comes in the room who's shorter than everybody else, it's going to bring down the average. So that marginal person coming in has a lower height, lower than the average, so the average comes down. Just as in this picture, the marginal cost is lower than the average. The marginal cost is lower than the average total cost, so average total cost comes down. Then if you look over on the far right of this picture, you see a situation where average total cost is rising, and that's just like the situation where a taller person came into the room, taller than average person came in the room, is going to raise the average. And so in this case, the marginal cost is greater than the average, and the average rises as a result, just a common feature of averages. The same kind of thing will occur with average total cost, but the most important thing here is average total cost is above average variable cost, and average variable cost rises over time after its bottom point as well. Now, there's certain interesting features that you always have to keep in mind when you think about cost curves like this, and I'm just going to list them here because what you need to do to use cost curves, you need to draw them. You need to sit down with a pencil and paper and draw them yourself. We're going to emphasize that a lot. You're going to get a lot of mileage out of these cost curves. So just remember what I just said. Marginal cost curve should cut through the average total cost and the average variable cost curves at their lowest point. That's what we saw in this example, and it's a general proposition. In addition, the average total cost curve and the average variable cost curve should get closer to each other as the quantity increases. That is, the gap between the two diminishes. And remember, the reason for that is average fixed cost declines throughout the range of production. And then to make the diagram a little interesting, a little flourish, you can add a little dip at the start of the marginal cost curve to represent the fact that marginal cost can decline actually at low levels of output. So given all this, let's just take a chance and draw the cost curves yourself. I'll draw it on the screen. So let's use that information to draw a cost curves for a particular firm. So we can put on the vertical axis, we're going to put the dollars as usual. And on the horizontal axis, we're going to put the quantity, let's just call it Q, that's produced. I'm not going to label the axes with particular units because this is kind of a generic picture that characterizes the important properties of the curves. So first of all, the marginal cost curve. And so remember, that's got a little flourish at the beginning, but it's basically increasing throughout the entire range of production. That little flourish there represents declining marginal costs for very low levels of production. So we'll label it marginal cost. Then we put in the average total cost, which has got to have that U shape, but it's got to go through the marginal cost curve at the bottom point of average total cost. So it's coming down, it's coming down, it's coming down, and it turns just as it hits the marginal cost curve, and we call that, label that average total costs. And then finally, the average variable cost, which is going to be below average total cost, but the gap between the two diminishes over time. So we can draw it like this. It's supposed to be getting closer to the average total cost curve. Let's label it average variable costs. And you can see this is supposed to be the bottom point of average total cost. This is supposed to be the bottom point of average variable cost. And they go through the marginal cost curve just at that bottom point. Let's look at a finished version of this picture where we now got the colored lines to distinguish, but it's effectively just what I just did in a sketch. So remember this curve. Marginal cost increasing, except for this little flourish at the beginning to make it interesting. Average total cost is U-shaped, passes through the marginal cost curve at the bottom of average total cost. And finally, average variable cost, also U-shaped, passes through marginal cost when average total cost is at the minimum. And then it gets closer. We're going to use this curve for the next few lessons and make it go to work so we can see how firms described in this way behave over time. Thank you.